I opened the door to my lavish birthday party, only to see everyone cheering and clapping as my wife's rich CEO proposes to her. Say yes, say yes. Everyone screamed. You need an alpha man, he said. So I walked away, canceled every payment, and pulled out my 90% company share $157 million worth. Minutes later, my phone lit up with 256 missed calls, and someone showed up at my door. You know what they say about turning 40? That it's supposed to be some kind of milestone, a moment where you look back at your life and feel satisfied with what you've built. Well, standing in the Ritzwood Grand Ballroom with its crystal chandeliers dripping like frozen tears and marble floors so polished you could perform surgery on them, I thought I was about to have one of those hallmark moments. The kind where your loving wife surprises you with all your closest friends and business associates. Everyone raises a toast, and you feel like you've actually made it in this dog-eat-dog world we call corporate America. Boy, was I wrong. Like, spectacularly, catastrophically, should have seen it coming from orbit wrong. The evening started innocently enough. Clarraine had been acting mysterious for weeks, whispering into her phone in that breathy way she does when she's planning something elaborate. I figured she was organizing another one of her over-the-top social events. The woman could turn a trip to Starbucks into a production worthy of Broadway. But hey, after 15 years of marriage, you learn to appreciate the effort, even when it comes with a price tag that could feed a small village for a month. I'd even brought her a gift tonight. A diamond necklace that cost more than most people's cars, wrapped in Tiffany blue with a card that read something embarrassingly sappy about how she made every day worth celebrating. Real Lifetime movie stuff, but I meant every word. That's the thing about being married to someone for a decade and a half. You start to believe in the fairy tale, even when the fairy tale costs you a fortune in designer gowns and spa weekends in the Hamptons. The ballroom was packed with faces I recognized from the tech world. Investors, board members, employees from Clarigen Technologies, the company I'd built from the ground up with nothing but my grandmother's inheritance and more sleepless nights than I care to count. Everyone was dressed to the nines, champagne glasses glittering under those ridiculous chandeliers, conversations buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes from an open bar and expensive hors d'oeuvres. But something felt off. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, call it the same gut instinct that had helped me turn a garage startup into a $157 million empire. But the crowd wasn't looking at me. Hell, half of them weren't even acknowledging I existed, which is pretty impressive considering it was supposedly my birthday party. Instead, they were all facing the center of the ballroom like they were watching some kind of performance. That's when I saw him. Victor Langford, Clarraine CEO at the company I'd foolishly let her run while I focused on the technical side. The guy was everything I wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that looks like it was chiseled by Michelangelo himself. He had that whole alpha male thing going on that makes middle-aged women swoon and makes guys like me feel like we should be checking our stock portfolios for reassurance. But it wasn't Victor's presence that made my blood run cold. It was his position. The bastard was down on one knee, holding up a diamond ring the size of a small planet, and the crowd, my crowd, at my birthday party, was chanting like they were at a freaking football game. Say yes, they shouted, their voices echoing off the marble walls like some kind of twisted prayer. And there was Clarraine, standing over him with this expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't surprise, wasn't shock, wasn't even confusion. It was pure, radiant joy, the kind of happiness that only comes from getting exactly what you've been wanting for a very long time. She looked like a woman who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment, and that's when it hit me. She had been waiting. This wasn't some spontaneous romantic gesture. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the script. Victor looked up at her with that smug grin he usually reserved for board meetings where he'd managed to increase his budget by another few million. You need an alpha man, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The crowd laughed like it was the punchline to some inside joke I wasn't in on. Which, apparently, I wasn't. I stood there holding my gift like an idiot, watching my wife of 15 years beam down at another man like he'd just offered her the moon on a silver platter. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that stung like hell. The worst part was realizing that this moment felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced it in front of a mirror. When she whispered yes, in that breathy, theatrical way she used when she wanted to sound spontaneous. I knew without a doubt that this whole thing had been planned down to the last detail. The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to go on forever, champagne glasses clinking, camera phones flashing, everyone treating this like it was the social event of the season. Which, I suppose it was. Just not the kind I'd been expecting when I put on my best suit and drove to what I thought was my own birthday celebration. Here's the thing about moments like this. You have two choices. You can make a scene, you can beg and plead and make yourself look even more pathetic than you already do, or you can maintain whatever dignity you have left and walk away with your head held high. I've seen guys in similar situations choose the first option, and it never ends well. They become cautionary tales, memes on social media, the kind of stories people tell at dinner parties when they want to make everyone feel uncomfortable. So I did what I do best in crisis situations. I compartmentalized. I treated it like a hostile takeover, like a board meeting where the numbers don't add up and you need to cut your losses before they get worse. I didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't even raise my voice. I simply turned around and walked out of that ballroom with the same calm composure I'd used leaving any other business meeting that had gone sideways. The valet brought my car around without comment, though I could see the pity in his eyes. Word travels fast in places like this, especially when it involves public humiliation and diamond rings the size of golf balls. I tipped him anyway. No point in taking out my frustration on someone just trying to make a living. But as I sat in my car, watching the Ritzwood Grand's elegant facade in my rearview mirror, something clicked in my brain. It was the same feeling I'd had 20 years ago when I first realized I could turn code into money, when I understood that the right algorithm at the right time could change everything. My mind sharpened, focused, like a lens coming into perfect clarity. This was the moment I stopped financing my own humiliation. I pulled out my phone and logged into Clarigen's financial system, the same system I'd built from scratch and still controlled with my 90% ownership stake. All those years of letting Clarraine play CEO while I handled the real work. All those times I'd signed off on her expenses without question because I trusted her. All of it was about to change. My finger hovered over the screen, over the controls that would freeze every account, halt every transaction, lock down every aspect of the company's financial operations. $157 million in assets. All of it traced back to patents I'd filed, algorithms I'd created, and investments I'd made with my own money and my grandmother's inheritance. One click, and everything would freeze. One click, and the party would be over for real. You know what's funny about revenge? Everyone thinks it's this hot, impulsive thing. Like you're supposed to go off half-cocked, making dramatic gestures and burning bridges while screaming about justice. But real revenge, the kind that actually works, is cold as a Minnesota winter and twice as calculated. It's paperwork, not pyrotechnics. And right now, sitting in my home office at 3 a.m, I was about to serve up a dish that had been 20 years in the making. My office is the one room in this penthouse that Clarraine never got her perfectly manicured hands on. While she was busy turning the rest of our home into some kind of interior design magazine fever dream. All white marble and gold accents that screamed, "Look how much money we have." I kept this space exactly how I wanted it. Dark mahogany walls, leather chairs that actually looked lived in, and bookshelves filled with technical manuals instead of the decorative nonsense she favored. No crystal vases, no abstract art that cost more than most people's mortgages, just a place where a man could think without feeling like he was living in a museum. The wall safe sat behind a painting of my grandmother, the only family portrait Clarraine couldn't convince me to replace with something more contemporary. Grandma Rose would have taken one look at tonight's circus and laughed until her teeth fell out. She always said that fancy people were just regular people wearing expensive masks, and boy, was she right about that. The woman who taught me that real wealth comes from owning things that matter, not from looking like you do. The safe opened with a satisfying click, revealing the black folder I hadn't touched in months. Foundations, I'd labeled it, because that's what it contained. The bedrock of everything I'd built. The paper trail that proved beyond any shadow of doubt who really owned what in this little empire of mine. Clarraine might have been the face of Clarigen Technologies, the one giving interviews to tech magazines and posing for Forbes covers, but ownership? That was a completely different story. I spread the documents across my desk like a lawyer preparing for the trial of the century. The original incorporation papers, filed 23 years ago when I was still young enough to believe that hard work automatically led to success and naive enough to think that people wouldn't try to steal what you'd earned. My signature, clear as day, claiming 90% ownership. Victor's name was nowhere to be found. Hell, the guy was probably still in college, learning how to charm his way through business school, while I was pulling all-nighters writing the code that would eventually make us all rich. Then came the patent filings, page after page of them, each one representing months of work, breakthrough moments that came at 2 in the morning when everyone else was sleeping. The emotion recognition algorithms that made our AI so damn good at understanding human behavior. The data compression techniques that let us process information faster than anyone else in the industry. The security protocols that kept our clients' information safer than Fort Knox. Every single one filed under my name. Every single one funded with money I'd earned or inherited. And there it was, the paper that told the real story, the transfer documentation showing how I'd seeded the company with my life savings and my grandmother's inheritance. $200,000 that represented every penny I had in the world, plus another $300,000 from the woman who'd raised me after my parents decided that raising a kid was too much work. $500,000 that turned into $157 million over 2 decades of smart decisions, brutal work schedules, and the kind of calculated risks that keep you awake at night wondering if you've just bet everything on the wrong horse. Clarraine had contributed exactly $0 to the initial investment. Her name appeared on the incorporation papers as a 10% shareholder, a wedding gift I'd given her when we got married because I was young and stupid and thought that love meant sharing everything. Victor, the man currently wearing my wife's engagement ring, had contributed nothing but a business school degree and the kind of smooth-talking confidence that impresses people who don't know the difference between actual leadership and expensive haircuts. But here's the beautiful thing about legal documents. They don't give a damn about your feelings. They don't care if you've been humiliated in front of 200 people. Don't care if your wife is currently celebrating her engagement to another man. Don't care if you feel like your entire life has been turned into some kind of reality TV show. They just state facts, cold and clear and absolutely indisputable. I own 90% of a company worth $157 million. Victor owned 0%. Clarraine owned 10% that was looking more and more like collateral for what I was about to do to both of them. Time to put those facts to work. The first call I made was to our bank, using the emergency line that comes with having 8 figures in various accounts. Amazing how quickly they pick up when you're calling about freezing that much money. Mr. Monroe, the night manager said, and I could practically hear him sitting up straighter. How can we assist you this evening? I need to freeze all corporate accounts for Clarigen Technologies, effective immediately, I said, keeping my voice as calm as if I were ordering a sandwich. Security concern. Potential fraud. Of course, sir. May I ask? You may not. I cut him off. This is under my authority as majority shareholder and chief financial officer. The paperwork will be on your desk in the morning. Next came the credit cards. Corporate accounts that had been funding Clarraine's lifestyle for years. Private jets to wine country, shopping trips to Milan, spa weekends that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every single one frozen with a phone call. Let's see how quickly Victor's alpha male routine holds up when his new fiancée can't afford her morning latte without asking daddy for an allowance. The luxury trips were next. That weekend in Napa they'd been planning. The one where I wasn't invited because I was supposedly too focused on work to appreciate the finer things. Cancelled. The reservations at Lou Bernardine for their celebration dinner? Gone. The suite at the plaza they'd booked for their engagement weekend? Available for someone else to enjoy. But the real masterpiece was freezing the payroll system. Not the employees' salaries. I'm not a monster, and the people actually doing the work deserve to get paid. But the executive bonuses, the consulting fees, the mysterious business development expenses that had been bleeding the company dry for months, all of it stopped with the push of a button. I leaned back in my chair and waited. In the corporate world, money is like blood, cut off the flow, and you find out real quick which parts of the body are actually essential and which parts are just along for the ride. Clarraine and Victor were about to discover that they'd been living high on someone else's dime, and that someone had just decided the party was over. My phone lit up first, 256 missed calls in the space of an hour, which had to be some kind of record. Text messages flooded in like water through a broken dam, each one more frantic than the last. But the real confirmation that my message had been received came from the intercom system. Patrick Doyle, the night concierge, sounded like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Mr. Monroe? I apologize for the late hour, but there's a young woman downstairs who says she works for your wife. She seems quite distressed. Says it's urgent. Should I send her up? I smiled for the first time all evening. The messenger had arrived. There's something almost biblical about watching a carefully constructed lie crumble in real time. You know, like those old stories where the mighty fall and the meek inherit the earth. Except in this version, the mighty are wearing designer dresses, and the inheritance is a tech company worth 9 figures. Standing at my penthouse door at 4:15 in the morning, I was about to witness the first act of what I was already thinking of as the Clarain collapse, a financial disaster that would make the Hindenburg look like a successful landing. Elisa Vargas looked like she'd been through a blender set to corporate nightmare. Clarain's assistant. Excuse me, executive coordinator, because God forbid anyone in that woman's orbit have a job title that didn't sound like it required an MBA, stood in my hallway clutching a coffee cup like it was the last life preserver on the Titanic. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged in ways that suggested either a complete breakdown or a very long night of ugly crying. Possibly both. The poor kid couldn't have been more than 25, fresh out of some overpriced college with dreams of climbing the corporate ladder in her sensible heels and carefully curated young professional wardrobe. Right now, though, she looked like someone had just explained to her that Santa Claus wasn't real, the tooth fairy was a lie, and her boss was about to become unemployed in the most spectacular way possible. Mr. Monroe, she stammered, and I could practically hear her mental script falling apart in real time. I'm so sorry to bother you at this hour, but Mrs. Monroe sent me to discuss what she's calling a technical glitch with the company's financial systems. Technical glitch. That was rich. Like calling the bombing of Pearl Harbor a navigation error, or describing the Titanic as having minor ice-related complications. But I had to admire Clarain's optimism. Even when her entire world was collapsing around her designer shoes, she was still trying to spin it as some kind of innocent mistake that could be fixed with the right combination of charm and denial. Come in, I said, stepping aside to let her into the apartment. Can I get you some coffee? You look like you could use it. Or maybe something stronger. It's been a long night for all of us. Elisa shook her head, but I could see her hands trembling as she clutched that coffee cup. Poor kid probably hadn't slept in 24 hours, running around trying to put out fires that kept multiplying faster than she could handle them. This is what happens when you work for people who build their entire empire on someone else's foundation. Eventually, the owner decides to reclaim his property, and everyone caught in the middle gets crushed. She asked me to tell you that the payroll system has frozen. Elisa continued, reading from what looked like notes scribbled on a napkin. The investor meeting for tomorrow morning had to be canceled because the conference room reservation was declined. Mr. Langford's corporate credit cards are showing as suspended, and the accounts payable system is locked down completely. I nodded thoughtfully, like this was all news to me instead of the carefully orchestrated financial apocalypse I'd been orchestrating from my home office for the past 3 hours. Sounds like a pretty comprehensive technical glitch, I said. Almost like someone with system administrator access decided to shut everything down simultaneously. But that couldn't be right. Something like that would require someone with majority ownership and executive authority. The color drained from Elisa's face as the implications hit her. She might be young, but she wasn't stupid. She'd been working closely enough with Clarain to understand the company's power structure, even if her boss had been pretending it was different than reality. Mrs. Monroe is hoping you might be able to fix the situation, she said carefully, like she was walking through a minefield in high heels. She mentioned that you have some technical expertise in this area. I do indeed, I replied, walking over to my desk and pulling out a manila envelope I prepared while waiting for this exact conversation. In fact, I've already diagnosed the problem and prepared a comprehensive solution. Would you like to hear it? Elisa nodded, though she looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Maybe getting a root canal, or audited by the IRS, or explaining to her parents why she'd chosen to work for people who were about to become the laughingstock of the tech industry. I opened the envelope and pulled out 7 pages of legal documentation that had taken me exactly 43 minutes to draft and would take Lorraine considerably longer to digest. The technical glitch, as your boss calls it, is actually the system working exactly as designed. You see, when someone owns 90% of a company but allows other people to spend money like it's monopoly cash, eventually the owner might decide to reassert control over his assets. I handed her the papers, watching her eyes widen as she scanned the first page. These are my terms for restoring normal operations. 7 simple requirements that address what I've discovered has been some rather creative accounting over the past few years. The terms were beautiful in their simplicity and brutal in their completeness. First, Lorraine resigns from all positions at Clarigen Technologies, effective immediately. Second, Victor Langford is permanently banned from any involvement with the company, its subsidiaries, or its business partners. Third, I resume my rightful position as Chief Executive Officer with complete operational control. Fourth, implementation of a $157 million repayment plan to recover funds that had been, let's call them, misallocated over the years. Fifth, a public statement acknowledging the true ownership structure and my role as founder and majority shareholder. Sixth, immediate termination of all lifestyle privileges funded through corporate accounts. And seventh, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that would make sure this little family drama stayed out of the tabloids. She has 24 hours to review and sign. I continued, watching Elisa's face cycle through about 15 different expressions as she processed each clause. After that, we moved from the friendly resolution phase to the let the lawyers sort it out phase, which tends to be considerably more expensive for everyone involved. I'd already put my team in motion while waiting for this conversation. A.O. Mensah, my lawyer, had been reviewing corporate bylaws since midnight, building the legal framework for what was about to become the most thorough hostile takeover in recent memory. Except this time, the hostile party was the actual owner. Riya Patel, head of security, was conducting a full audit of financial irregularities that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. Between the two of them, I had enough ammunition to turn this whole situation into a legal nightmare for anyone stupid enough to fight me. But I was hoping it wouldn't come to that. Despite everything that had happened tonight, despite the humiliation and the betrayal and the sheer audacity of thinking they could steal my company while I watched, I still wanted this to end with signatures on paper instead of subpoenas and depositions. Elisa clutched the envelope like it contained live explosives, which in a way, it did. What should I tell her? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, and for the first time in hours, it felt genuine. Tell her the system isn't broken, Elisa. Tell her it's working exactly as designed. There's something almost poetic about watching someone's world collapse at the exact moment they thought they were winning. Like watching a house of cards fall in slow motion, each level taking the next one down until nothing's left but scattered pieces and the echo of what used to be impressive. 22 hours after I'd handed Elisa my terms, I was standing at my penthouse door listening to the sound of Lorraine Monroe. Soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Monroe, having what could generously be called a complete mental breakdown. The banging on my door didn't sound like knocking so much as drowning. You know that desperate, rhythmless pounding that comes from someone who's run out of options and is now operating on pure panic? That was Lorraine at 11:47 p.m., hammering on my door like she was trying to wake the dead or summon the financial gods to reverse the last 24 hours of her life. When I opened the door, I barely recognized the woman standing in my hallway. This wasn't the polished, camera-ready CEO who'd been posing for magazine covers and giving keynote speeches about female leadership in tech. This was someone who looked like she'd been wrestling with reality and losing badly. Her usually perfect hair was a mess, sticking up at angles that suggested she'd been running her hands through it for hours. The designer dress she'd worn to our her engagement party was wrinkled and stained with what looked like wine or tears or possibly both. But it was her eyes that really told the story, wild, desperate, the kind of look you see in cornered animals who've just realized the trap has no exit. "You can't destroy us," she said, pushing past me into the apartment without invitation. Her voice had that particular quality that comes from somewhere between rage and complete desperation, like she was trying to sound commanding, but couldn't quite pull it off when her entire world was crumbling around her Louboutin heels. "There is no us," I replied, closing the door with the same calm I'd used to end any other business transaction. "There hasn't been an us for quite some time, apparently. There's me, there's you, and there's the company I built that you've been treating like your personal piggy bank." She whirled around to face me, and for a moment I thought she might actually take a swing. But Clarraine had always been more about psychological warfare than physical confrontation, probably because assault charges would have looked bad in the tech magazines that loved to feature her as a power woman breaking barriers in Silicon Valley. "This whole thing is insane," she continued, starting to pace around my living room like a caged tiger. "You're acting like some kind of a vindictive child having a tantrum because you didn't like my birthday surprise." Birthday surprise. That was what she was calling it now. Like staging a public proposal from another man at what was supposed to be my 40th birthday celebration was some kind of innocent prank instead of the most humiliating betrayal I could imagine. The woman had chutzpah, I'd give her that. "Let me ask you something, Clarraine," I said, settling into my favorite chair and watching her wear a path in my carpet. "At what point during the planning of this birthday surprise did you think I'd find it charming? Was it when you were picking out the venue, knowing I'd be standing there like an idiot while another man proposed to my wife? Or maybe when you were practicing your acceptance speech in the mirror, making sure you looked surprised enough to fool the cameras?" Her pacing stopped for just a moment, and I caught a flash of something that might have been guilt before the desperation took over again. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she said, but even she didn't sound convinced. "Victor said it would be a way to show everyone how strong our relationship was. He said you'd understand, that you'd see the humor in it." Victor said. Victor fucking said. The man had convinced my wife that publicly humiliating me would somehow strengthen our marriage, and she'd been dumb enough to believe it. Or maybe she'd wanted to believe it because it gave her permission to do what she'd been wanting to do anyway. "So this was Victor's idea," I said, not really asking. "Let me guess. He told you that real alpha males don't get threatened by a little friendly competition. That confident men would see the whole thing as entertainment. That I'd probably laugh and buy everyone a round of drinks." The look on her face told me I'd hit the bullseye. The poor woman had been played by a guy who understood exactly which buttons to push, who knew she was just insecure enough about our marriage to believe that public humiliation was some kind of relationship test. "He said," she started, then trailed off, probably realizing how pathetic it was going to sound when she said it out loud. "He said what, Clarraine? That this would prove I really loved you? That if I could handle watching him put a ring on your finger in front of 200 people, it would show everyone what a secure, modern marriage we had." I laughed, and it sounded bitter even to me. "Or did he tell you that I'd be so desperate to prove myself that I'd start throwing even more money around? Maybe give him a bigger budget or a corner office with a better view?" She collapsed onto my Italian leather sofa, the one piece of furniture we'd actually picked out together, back when we still talked about we and us and our future. Watching her break down on that couch felt like some kind of cosmic irony, like the universe had a sense of humor about these things. The tears started then, not the pretty kind you see in movies, but the ugly, mascara-running kind that comes from genuine despair. "I'll sign your papers," she whispered, her voice so small I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "But you have to understand, this isn't just about me. Victor, the employees, the investors, you're ending my life." "No," I said, and my voice was gentler than I'd expected it to be. "I'm ending the lie you've been living at my expense. There's a difference." I walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere out there, Victor was probably trying to figure out how to explain to his new fiancée that their entire lifestyle had just evaporated overnight. Somewhere else, Elisa was probably updating her resume and wondering how she'd explain her last job to potential employers. "You burned through $157 million of company funds over the past 5 years, I continued, still looking out at the lights. "Money that came from patents I filed, algorithms I wrote, investments I made with my own savings, and my grandmother's inheritance. Now you get to pay it back." "That's impossible," she sobbed. "I don't have that kind of money. Nobody has that kind of money." "Then I guess you'll be making payments for a very long time," I replied. "Consider it a learning experience. A very expensive lesson in the difference between owning something and borrowing it." They say that power is like gravity, invisible until someone falls, and then everyone suddenly remembers how it works. Sitting at the head of the Clarigen Technologies boardroom table at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, I was about to give 12 very expensive suits a crash course in basic physics. The kind of lesson that would be talked about in business schools for years, assuming any of these people still had careers left to talk about it. The boardroom itself was a monument to Cloraine's taste for dramatic excess. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a conference table that could double as a landing strip, and chairs that cost more than most people's cars. Everything designed to intimidate, to make visitors feel small and grateful just to be in the presence of such obvious success. Too bad none of them had bothered to ask who was actually paying for all this theatrical nonsense. The board members filed in like they were attending their own funeral, which in a way, they were. 12 faces that had spent the last few years nodding along to whatever Cloraine suggested, collecting their director fees, and enjoying the catered lunches that came with rubber-stamping decisions they didn't understand. Not one of them had bothered to ask the basic questions you'd think might occur to people supposedly overseeing a $157 million company. Questions like, who actually owns this place? Who filed the patents that generate our revenue? And why does the majority shareholder never seem to be consulted on major decisions? Janet Morrison, our CFO, looked particularly green around the gills. The woman had been signing off on expense reports and budget allocations for 3 years without apparently wondering where the money was coming from, or who had the authority to approve spending that would make a Fortune 500 executive blush. Today she was about to discover that her signature had been authorizing the systematic looting of a company she didn't even understand. And then there was Cloraine, sitting at the far end of the table like Marie Antoinette waiting for the guillotine. 24 hours ago, she'd been the golden girl of Silicon Valley, the female CEO who was supposedly breaking glass ceilings and inspiring a generation of women in tech. Now she looked like someone who'd spent the night wrestling with the realization that her entire professional identity had been built on someone else's foundation. She'd tried to salvage some dignity with her appearance, fresh makeup, professional blazer, hairstyle to within an inch of its life. But there's only so much you can do when you're about to publicly confess that your entire career has been an elaborate fiction. The woman who'd been giving interviews about female entrepreneurship and the importance of women owning their success was about to admit that she'd never owned anything except the 10% equity I'd given her as a wedding gift. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, standing at the head of the table like a prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. Thank you all for attending this emergency board meeting. I realize some of you are confused about why you're here, so let me clarify the situation with a few simple announcements. The silence in that room was so complete you could have heard a stock price drop. These people were used to Cloraine running meetings with her usual blend of corporate buzzwords and motivational speaking. They weren't prepared for someone who actually understood how the company worked to start explaining things in plain English. First, I continued. Effective immediately, Cloraine Monroe is resigning from her position as Chief Executive Officer and from all other positions within this organization. The collective intake of breath was audible. 12 faces turned toward Cloraine like they were expecting her to stand up and explain that this was some kind of joke, that the woman they'd been treating as their leader for the past 5 years wasn't actually about to disappear from their professional lives. Second, I am resuming my position as Chief Executive Officer and assuming the newly created role of Financial Oversight Director, with full veto power over all expenditures exceeding $5,000. Janet Morrison's face went from green to white so fast I thought she might actually faint. The woman had been approving expenses that would have funded small countries, and she was just now realizing that someone with actual authority might want to review her decision-making process. Third, Victor Langford is hereby permanently banned from any involvement with this company, its subsidiaries, partners, or associated business entities. Any existing contracts, consulting agreements, or business relationships involving Mr. Langford are terminated immediately. That got some murmurs. Half of these people probably didn't even know who Victor was, but the other half had watched him parade around like he owned the place, making decisions and spending money like he had some kind of actual authority instead of just good cheekbones and an MBA from whatever overpriced business school had taught him to confuse confidence with competence. Now, I said, walking over to the whiteboard that Clarraine usually used for her inspirational corporate messaging. I'm sure some of you are wondering about the authority behind these decisions. Allow me to clarify the actual ownership structure of this company. I started writing numbers, big and clear so even the people in the back could see them. 90% ownership, myself. 10% ownership, Clarraine Monroe. 0% ownership, everyone else in this room, including our recently departed Mr. Langford. The math was simple, but I could see their brains struggling to process it. For years, they'd been operating under the assumption that Clarraine was the driving force behind Clarigen Technologies, that she was some kind of visionary entrepreneur who'd built this empire through sheer force of will and feminine empowerment. The idea that she'd been essentially an employee with a fancy title was apparently too much for some of them to handle. But wait, I continued, moving to the next section of the whiteboard. There's more. Let's talk about where our revenue actually comes from. I started listing patents, algorithms, and proprietary technologies, each one followed by a filing date and my signature. 23 patents in total, generating approximately $89 million in annual licensing fees. Every single one developed by me, filed by me, owned by me. The technology that made Clarigen profitable enough to fund Clarraine's lifestyle and Victor's consulting fees had been created by the guy they'd apparently forgotten was still around. And just for fun, I said, adding up the numbers with the kind of theatrical flourish Clarraine usually reserved for her TED Talks. Let's review Mrs. Monroe's contributions to the company's intellectual property portfolio over the past 5 years. I wrote a big, beautiful 0 on the whiteboard. Her contributions to our patent revenue. Another 0. Her contributions to our core algorithms. 0 again. Her personal investment in the company's initial funding. 0, 0, 0. By now, Clarraine looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor, but she'd already agreed to this part of my terms. The public acknowledgement, the confession that would set the record straight after years of letting people believe a carefully constructed fiction. She stood up slowly, pulled out a prepared statement, and began reading in the kind of flat, defeated voice usually reserved for prisoners confessing to crimes. I want to clarify for the record that my husband was always the founder, chief architect, and majority owner of Clarigen Technologies. While I have served as CEO, all core technologies, patents, and intellectual property were developed by him. The company's success is primarily due to his innovations and business acumen. The board stared at her like she'd just announced that gravity was optional and the earth was actually flat. Years of assumptions, crashing down in a single paragraph. Janet Morrison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What about her 10% equity stake? I smiled, and this time it felt genuinely warm. Collateral for her $157 million debt. You know what they say about following the money? That it always leads you somewhere interesting, usually somewhere the people spending it really don't want you to go. Well, after 24 hours of my crack team digging through Clarigen's financial records like forensic archaeologists excavating a crime scene, interesting was turning out to be the understatement of the century. What we were uncovering wasn't just creative accounting. It was a masterclass in corporate fraud that would have made Bernie Madoff take notes. My war room had been set up in the executive conference room, the one with the good coffee machine and the windows that looked out over the city like we were planning the D-Day invasion. Which, in a way, we were. Except instead of liberating Europe, we were liberating my company from the parasites who'd been treating it like their personal ATM for the better part of 5 years. Rhea Patel, my head of security, had the kind of smile that usually preceded someone's career ending in handcuffs. She'd spread vendor contracts across the table like a card shark revealing a royal flush. Except in this case, the royal flush was 2 completely fabricated shell companies that had been billing Clarigen for services that existed only in someone's imagination. So here's what we've got, Rhea said, pointing to a stack of invoices thick enough to use as a doorstop. Synergy Solutions LLC and Dynamic Business Consulting Incorporated. Both companies allegedly providing strategic advisory services and operational optimization consulting. Both companies billing us approximately $30,000 per month for the past 3 years. Let me guess, I said, already knowing where this was going. Neither company actually exists. Oh, they exist, Rhea replied, and her grin got even wider. They're both registered to P.O. boxes in Delaware. The incorporation papers list Victor Langford as the sole proprietor of Synergy Solutions, and guess who owns Dynamic Business Consulting? She slid another document across the table, and there it was in black and white. Clarraine Monroe, listed as the founder and CEO of a consulting company that had been billing my actual company for imaginary work. The woman had literally been paying herself a salary to consult for the company she was supposedly already running. It was like finding out your employee had been clocking in twice for the same job, except instead of overtime pay, we were talking about nearly $2 million in fraudulent billing. Anoja Bello, my forensic accountant, looked like a kid on Christmas morning who'd just discovered that Santa had left him a pile of financial irregularities under the tree. The man lived for this kind of detective work, turning corporate malfeasance into spreadsheets and turning spreadsheets into criminal evidence. He'd been hunched over his laptop for 16 hours straight, mapping out what he was calling the most elegant theft I've ever seen. The beauty of their system, Anoja explained, pulling up a flowchart that looked like something from a John Le Carre novel, is that it's technically legal. Barely legal, but legal. They set up legitimate consulting companies, filed the proper paperwork, even paid taxes on the income. The problem is that the services they were billing for were either never performed or were already part of their regular job duties. He clicked through to another screen, showing a timeline that stretched back 48 months. See, Victor would submit a proposal for strategic market analysis through Synergy Solutions. Clarraine would approve it as CEO. Then Dynamic Business Consulting would bill for implementation oversight of the same project. It's like paying two different companies to watch each other work, except both companies were owned by the same people who were approving the contracts. Luis Herrera, our HR director, had been conducting what he diplomatically called informal interviews with staff members, which was corporate speak for finding out who knew what and when they knew it. Luis had the kind of face that made people want to confess things, probably because he looked like everyone's favorite uncle, the one who'd keep your secrets but also make sure you learned from your mistakes. Most of the staff had no idea, Luis reported, flipping through a notebook filled with what looked like the testimonies of witnesses at a very white-collar crime scene. But a few of the senior people mentioned feeling uncomfortable about some of the consulting contracts. Sarah in accounting said she'd questioned several invoices, but was told by Clarraine that these were board-approved strategic initiatives that were above her pay grade to understand. Translation, I said. They were using corporate hierarchy to shut down anyone who asked awkward questions about where the money was going. Exactly. And here's the kicker. Luis flipped to another page. 3 different employees mentioned seeing Victor and Clarraine working on proposals together, but when the invoices came through, they were always from his consulting company for work he was supposedly doing independently. But the real smoking gun came from Ria's deep dive into the corporate email system. She'd found what she was calling the conspiracy thread, a series of emails that had been buried so deep in subfolders that it took specialized software to excavate them. The subject line alone was enough to make my blood boil. Birthday surprise. Optics plus leverage. This is where it gets really ugly, Ria said, pulling up the email chain on the main screen. The thread starts 6 months ago, between Clarraine, Victor, and someone named Harper North, who appears to be some kind of PR consultant specializing in what she calls viral corporate events. The first email was from Clarraine. V. Talk to Harper about your idea. She thinks a public proposal could generate significant media buzz for both of us. Could position me as the successful woman who chose love over a stagnant marriage. Thoughts? Victor's response was even worse. See, Harper's right about the optics. Your husband's been invisible in the company narrative for too long. Public proposal shows you're the one with real options, real power. Makes you look like the prize everyone wants. Plus, the humiliation factor should motivate him to prove himself financially. Win-win. They engineered the whole thing, I said, reading through emails that laid out the plan in excruciating detail. The venue, the timing, even the crowd's reaction. They choreographed my public humiliation like it was a fucking Broadway show. Harper North's contributions were the most professional and somehow the most disgusting. She'd treated my marriage like a marketing campaign, complete with target demographics and expected social media engagement. The key, she'd written in one email, is making sure the husband looks like the obvious loser in the scenario. Older, less charismatic, clearly out of his league. The contrast will make Victor look even more alpha and Clarraine look even more desirable. There were spreadsheets projecting media coverage, mock-ups of social media posts, even a timeline for follow-up interviews where Clarraine would talk about finding the courage to choose happiness, and Victor would discuss what real leadership looks like in modern relationships. They'd turn my 40th birthday into a corporate strategy session, my marriage into a publicity stunt, and my humiliation into a carefully calculated business decision designed to increase their personal brands while positioning me as the pathetic loser who couldn't hold onto his successful wife. Forward everything to AO, I said, feeling a cold anger settle into my chest like ice water. Every email, every contract, every fraudulent invoice. This just stopped being about money. Ria's smile turned predatory. Already done. Your lawyer says this moves us from hostile takeover territory into criminal conspiracy territory. Good, I replied, watching the city lights twinkle outside our windows like stars. Because the war just changed. There's something profoundly therapeutic about writing a check for $20 million when you're feeling like the entire corporate world has been treating you like a chump for the better part of a decade. Not because of the money itself. Though let's be honest, having enough cash to casually invest 8 figures does wonders for your sense of perspective, but because of what that check represents. It's proof that while other people were busy playing politics and staging publicity stunts, you were building something real, something valuable enough that you can afford to bet big on the future. Standing in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn that smelled like sawdust and possibility, I was about to do exactly that. Brightlayer AI occupied the kind of space that real entrepreneurs use when they're more interested in changing the world than impressing investors with marble lobbies and Italian leather furniture. Exposed brick walls, concrete floors, mismatched desks that looked like they'd been assembled from whatever was on sale at IKEA, and the kind of nervous energy that only comes from brilliant people working on problems that keep them awake at night. Layla Chun was 27 years old, and had the kind of focused intensity that reminded me of myself 20 years ago, back when I thought the biggest obstacle to success was finding enough hours in the day to write code. She'd built an emotion recognition AI system that could analyze micro-expressions and vocal patterns with an accuracy that made IBM's Watson look like a magic 8-ball. But she'd hit the wall that kills more startups than bad ideas and market crashes combined: training data. The problem isn't the algorithm, she explained, gesturing toward a whiteboard covered in equations that would make a MIT professor weep with joy. We can recognize emotional states with 94% accuracy when we have sufficient training data. But getting that data legally and ethically? That's where everything breaks down. She was pacing around the warehouse like a caged tiger, running her hands through hair that looked like she'd been pulling at it for weeks. The woman had clearly been surviving on coffee and determination for so long that a decent meal and 8 hours of sleep would probably kill her from the shock. Facebook has billions of tagged photos. Google has decades of search data. Amazon has every purchase decision anyone's ever made. But if you're a startup trying to build something that actually helps people instead of manipulating them into buying things they don't need, you're screwed. The data oligopoly makes sure of that. I understood her frustration better than she knew. The same problem had nearly killed Clarigen in its early days, back when I was spending 18-hour days trying to figure out how to compete with companies that had resources I couldn't even dream of. The difference was that I'd eventually found a way around the problem through pure stubborn persistence and more luck than any sane person should count on. Layla was just as smart as I'd been, probably smarter, but she was hitting the same wall at a time when the big tech companies had made that wall even higher. What if I told you? I said, pulling out my checkbook with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from having survived your own corporate apocalypse. That training data doesn't have to be your problem anymore. Her pacing stopped so abruptly, I thought she might have actually frozen mid-step. I'm sorry, what? $20 million. I continued, writing out the amount in my neat, careful handwriting. 40% equity, board seat, and enough funding to acquire all the training data you need through legitimate partnerships instead of trying to scrape together free samples. I tore off the check and held it out to her, watching her face cycle through about 15 different expressions as she processed what was happening. This was the moment that separated real entrepreneurs from people who just talked about changing the world. Some people would hesitate, worry about giving up control, spend weeks negotiating terms, and trying to squeeze every advantage out of the deal. Real entrepreneurs recognize opportunity when it's standing in front of them holding a check. Layla grabbed the check like it might evaporate if she didn't move fast enough. Are you serious right now? Because if this is some kind of joke, it's a really expensive way to mess with someone's head. Dead serious, I replied. I've spent the last week watching a company I built get looted by people who couldn't code their way out of a paper bag if you gave them the source code and a team of consultants. Being around people who actually understand technology, who care more about solving problems than posing for magazine covers. This feels like coming home. And it did. For the first time in years, I was in a room full of people who got excited about algorithms instead of stock options, who measured success in problem-solving rather than press coverage. These were my people, the ones who stayed up until 3 in the morning not because they had to, but because they'd just figured out how to make something work better. Dr. Otis Morgan, the CTO of Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, had been waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. Emergency room triage was still largely guesswork disguised as medical expertise, with overworked doctors trying to assess patient urgency based on incomplete information and gut instinct. BrightLayer's emotion recognition AI could analyze facial expressions, vocal stress patterns, and behavioral indicators to help medical staff identify patients who were in serious distress but unable to articulate their symptoms effectively. We're talking about saving lives, Dr. Morgan explained during our impromptu partnership meeting. People have heart attacks and strokes in our waiting room because they don't look sick enough to get immediate attention. Your system could flag those cases before they become tragedies. The pilot program we outlined would put BrightLayer's AI into 3 emergency departments across Brooklyn, analyzing patient interactions in real time and alerting medical staff when someone showed signs of severe distress that weren't obvious to human observation. It was exactly the kind of meaningful application that made all the technical challenges worth solving. Jules Tanaka, one of Layla's developers, exemplified everything I'd been missing at Clarigen. The kid was maybe 24 years old, so shy that making eye contact seemed physically painful for him. But when he sat down at his computer at 3 in the morning to fix a critical bug in the emotion mapping algorithm, magic happened. Not the corporate magic of good PR and strategic partnerships, but real magic. The kind where broken code becomes elegant solutions and theoretical problems become practical applications. Watching Jules' work reminded me why I'd fallen in love with technology in the first place. There's something pure about good code, something honest that you can't fake or spin or market your way around. Either the algorithm works or it doesn't. Either the system solves the problem or it fails. No amount of charisma or corporate buzzwords can make bad code perform better, and no amount of politics can make an elegant solution less beautiful. As I was leaving the warehouse, feeling more energized than I had in months, my phone buzzed with a text from Clarigen. Just 2 words, draft ready. Time to finish what we'd started. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone try to spin their way out of the truth, especially when you're the one holding all the facts and they're holding nothing but a handful of corporate buzzwords and wishful thinking. Sitting across from Clarigen at Café Solstice, a deliberately unremarkable coffee shop in Midtown that wouldn't attract paparazzi or tech bloggers looking for their next viral moment, I was about to witness the final death throes of a public relations strategy that had been doomed from the moment someone decided to turn my birthday party into a reality TV show. The cafe was exactly what I'd wanted for this conversation. Anonymous, quiet, and completely devoid of the kind of theatrical backdrop that Clarigen usually preferred for her public appearances. No marble countertops, no dramatic lighting, no strategically placed logo displays. Just worn wooden tables, the smell of decent coffee, and the kind of background noise that would make it impossible for anyone to accidentally record our conversation for later use on social media. Clarigen looked like she'd been styling herself for a hostage video. Gone were the power suits and carefully coordinated accessories that had been her trademark during the glory days of playing CEO. Instead, she'd opted for what I could only describe as contrite casual, a simple gray sweater, minimal makeup, and the kind of understated jewelry that was supposed to suggest humility and personal growth. Even her posture was different, less commanding and more apologetic, like she'd been practicing how to look appropriately sorry for cameras that weren't there. She slid a manila folder across the table with the careful precision of someone handling a live grenade. "The draft statement," she said, her voice carrying the flat, defeated tone of someone who'd finally run out of ways to avoid reality. "Harper North worked on the messaging for 3 days. She says this should minimize the damage to both our reputations." Harper North, the PR consultant who'd helped orchestrate my public humiliation, was now trying to manage the fallout from her own brilliant strategy. The woman who'd treated my marriage like a marketing campaign was apparently still on the payroll, still trying to find ways to spin disaster into opportunity. I opened the folder and started reading what could generously be called a masterpiece of corporate non-apology. The statement was everything I'd expected from someone who made a living turning lies into press releases. Carefully worded, strategically vague, and designed to acknowledge wrongdoing without actually admitting to anything that might be useful in a courtroom. "It has come to our attention that there have been some misunderstandings about the ownership and operational structure of Clarigen Technologies," the draft began. Misunderstandings, like the systematic theft of $157 million and the staging of my public humiliation, were just innocent communications failures that could be cleared up with better corporate messaging. While Clarraine Monroe has served effectively as chief executive officer, we want to clarify that the company's technical innovations and founding vision originated primarily with her business partner. Business partner, not husband, not majority owner, not the guy who'd spent 20 years building the company while she spent 20 years spending the profits. The whole thing continued in the same vein for 3 pages, acknowledging facts while avoiding responsibility, confirming details while deflecting blame. It was the kind of statement that would let everyone save face while ensuring that nobody actually learned anything useful from the experience. Corporate PR at its most cynical and least effective. I looked up from the draft to find Clarraine watching me with the desperate hope of someone waiting to hear that their cancer was benign. "What do you think?" she asked, and I could hear years of media training in the way she tried to make the question sound casual instead of life or death important. "I think," I said, pulling out a red pen with the deliberate ceremony of a professor grading a failing exam, "that Harper North doesn't understand the difference between damage control and truth-telling." I started rewriting the statement line by line, crossing out the euphemisms and replacing them with facts. Where the draft said misunderstandings, I wrote deliberate misrepresentation. Where it mentioned business partner, I wrote majority owner and founder. Where Harper had crafted careful non-apologies, I inserted specific admissions of responsibility. "You can't publish that," Clarraine said, watching me turn her PR strategy into something that would actually inform the public instead of confusing them. "It's too harsh. People will think." "People will think what exactly?" I interrupted. "That a woman who spent 5 years pretending to have built a company she didn't create, using money she didn't earn, while planning to humiliate her husband for social media content, might not be the inspiring feminist entrepreneur she pretended to be." I kept writing, and with each correction, I watched Clarraine's face go through the same emotional progression I'd seen from her during our midnight conversation. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, reluctant acceptance that the truth was going to come out whether she liked it or not. The final version was everything the original wasn't: clear, specific, and honest. It acknowledged my role as founder and majority owner. It admitted that Clarraine's position had been largely ceremonial. It confirmed that all major innovations and patents had been developed by me. Most importantly, it took responsibility for the financial irregularities and public deception without trying to spin them as innocent mistakes. "Sign it," I said, sliding the revised statement back across the table. She read through it twice, wincing at every factual correction, every honest admission, every sentence that would make it impossible for her to continue the fiction she'd been living. But she signed it anyway, because the alternative was watching me release the email evidence and the financial records that would make this public confession look generous by comparison. At exactly 8 means transparency o'clock the next morning, the statement went live on Clarigen's website, my personal LinkedIn profile, and every tech news platform that had ever featured Clarraine as an example of female leadership in Silicon Valley. By 9 o'clock, it was trending on Twitter. By 10, Tech bloggers were calling it the most honest corporate confession they'd ever seen. By noon, major business publications were reaching out for follow-up interviews. The tech press, starved for authenticity in an industry built on hype and performance, embraced the statement like it was water in the desert. Finally, a tech executive who tells the truth, wrote TechCrunch. The real story behind Silicon Valley's golden couple, proclaimed Wired. When transparency actually, headlined Forbes. Cloraine's social media went silent. Victor disappeared from public view entirely. The lifestyle bloggers who'd been covering their engagement as some kind of fairy tale romance quietly deleted their posts and moved on to less controversial topics. But the most satisfying response came from Dr. Morgan at Brooklyn Methodist, who called me personally to say that the statement had convinced his board to fast-track our Bright Layer pilot program. When someone's willing to tell the truth about their failures, he said, it makes me trust them with our successes. That evening, I finally dealt with the birthday gift that had started this whole mess. The diamond necklace, still wrapped in its Tiffany box, went to a scholarship auction in my grandmother's name. Let someone else's love story benefit from the ruins of mine. You know what's funny about downsizing your life? Everyone expects you to feel diminished, like trading a penthouse for a two-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side should come with some kind of existential crisis and a midlife sports car to compensate. But standing in my new living room with its normal-sized windows and furniture that didn't require a small loan to afford, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Sometimes getting smaller is actually about getting real, and getting real turns out to be a hell of a lot more comfortable than living in a museum dedicated to other people's ideas of success. The apartment was everything the penthouse wasn't: lived in, practical, and completely free of any pretentious bullshit. No marble countertops that cost more than most people's cars. No Italian leather furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. No crystal chandeliers that required their own insurance policy. Just normal stuff. A couch you could actually sit on without worrying about designer fabric. Windows you could open without triggering some kind of climate control system. And a kitchen where you could make coffee without feeling like you were performing surgery in a sterile operating room. The best part was the silence. Not the oppressive silence of a place so expensive that even the air felt intimidating, but the comfortable silence of a space where you could think without wondering who was watching or what impression you were supposed to be making. For the first time in a decade, I could walk around my own home without feeling like I was visiting someone else's idea of what my life should look like. 3 days a week, I was teaching at Columbia. Introduction to Algorithmic Thinking and Advanced Data Structures. The university had been thrilled to get someone with my background, especially after the public statement had established my actual credentials instead of letting people assume I was just some kind of silent partner in my wife's success story. There's something deeply satisfying about working with students who are hungry to learn instead of employees who are just trying to figure out how to game the system for their next promotion. My students were the kind of people I'd forgotten existed in the corporate world: brilliant, curious, and more interested in solving interesting problems than in networking their way into corner offices. They asked the kind of questions that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with programming in the first place, back when code was about elegance and efficiency instead of quarterly earnings and market positioning. Professor Monroe, one of them, had asked after class, "How do you know when an algorithm is actually good versus just commercially viable?" It was the kind of question that would never occur to someone like Victor, who measured the value of technology by how much money it could generate in the shortest possible time. But it was exactly the kind of question that mattered if you actually cared about building things that worked instead of things that sold. Brightlayer was thriving in ways that had nothing to do with stock prices or press coverage and everything to do with solving problems that mattered. Dr. Morgan's pilot program had been so successful that 3 more hospitals had signed on, and Jules had developed an enhancement that could predict panic attacks with 87% accuracy, giving emergency room staff crucial early warning when patients were about to have psychological crises that could complicate their medical treatment. Layla had grown into the kind of CEO I'd wanted to be 20 years ago: focused, principled, and completely uninterested in the performative aspects of leadership that had consumed so much of Cloraine's energy. She measured success in lives improved rather than magazine covers, and her team responded with the kind of dedication that only comes from believing in what you're building. The free templates I'd started offering to startup founders were getting more downloads than I'd expected. Turns out there were a lot of people who wanted to build something real, but didn't know how to protect themselves from the kind of corporate parasites that had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked for. Legal frameworks for majority ownership, financial controls to prevent unauthorized spending, and partnership agreements that actually protected the people doing the work. Basic stuff that business schools apparently didn't teach, but that could save entrepreneurs from learning expensive lessons the hard way. Clarraine had relocated to Portland, where she was teaching coding to kids at a nonprofit that specialized in getting underprivileged students interested in technology. The handwritten apology she'd sent me was surprisingly honest, free of the corporate speak and strategic messaging that had characterized our relationship for so many years. I lost myself in the performance, she'd written. I forgot that being successful and looking successful aren't the same thing. I'm sorry for the hurt I caused and the trust one broke. I hope someday you can forgive me, but I understand if you can't. I'd filed the letter away in my desk drawer, not because I was holding on to grudges, but because forgiveness and forgetting aren't the same thing either. The letter represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next, but it didn't erase the years of deception or the deliberate cruelty of that birthday party. Some things you move past without moving back to where you started. Victor had discovered that being an alpha male was considerably less impressive when you didn't have someone else's company to run or someone else's money to spend. The investor community had turned on him with the kind of swift, brutal efficiency that Silicon Valley reserved for people who'd been exposed as frauds. His consulting business had collapsed, his social media had gone quiet, and according to the gossip that occasionally filtered back through mutual acquaintances, he was working for a mid-tier marketing firm in New Jersey, spending his days creating PowerPoint presentations for companies that sold accounting software to dental practices. But the most unexpected development was Elisa. Clarraine's former assistant had joined Brightlayer as operations manager, and she turned out to have a natural talent for the kind of detailed project coordination that kept complex technical initiatives on track. Free from the toxic environment of corporate performance art, she'd blossomed into someone who could manage multiple hospital partnerships while keeping a team of brilliant but scattered engineers focused on deliverables and deadlines. You seem different, Carlos Alvarez, my new building's doorman, had mentioned the previous week. Lighter somehow, like you're not carrying around something heavy anymore. He was right, though I wasn't sure I could have explained it to him in a way that would make sense. I'd spent so many years trying to support a life that wasn't really mine, funding a version of success that required constant performance and endless expense. Now I was just living, working on projects that mattered, teaching students who cared about learning, investing in companies that solved real problems instead of creating impressive-looking quarterly reports. The money was still there, more than I could spend in several lifetimes, even after the divorce settlement and the various legal fees that had come with untangling 20 years of financial complications. But it felt different now, like a tool for doing interesting work instead of a scorecard for proving my worth to people whose opinions had never actually mattered. For the first time in years, I was sleeping well. Walking through Clarigen's offices 6 months later was like visiting a museum of my own past life. The champagne fountains were gone, replaced by engineers actually solving problems. The marble lobbies had been converted into collaborative workspaces where people wrote code instead of press releases. The culture charter I'd implemented was printed on simple paper and taped to walls. We build, or we don't spend. Real work. No stunts. Finally, the numbers told the story better than any corporate narrative ever could. R&D budgets restored to pre-fraud levels. 2 major patents filed in the last quarter alone. Employee satisfaction scores that actually meant something because we'd stopped paying consultants to fabricate them. Profit margins that reflected actual productivity instead of creative accounting. But the real victory wasn't happening in boardrooms or balance sheets. It was happening 60 blocks away in Brooklyn, where Brightlayer's emotion recognition AI was saving lives in emergency rooms. Dr. Morgan's latest report showed a 37% improvement in critical case identification, which translated to real people going home to their families instead of becoming statistics. Jules had developed a new module that could detect early signs of sepsis through microexpression analysis, giving doctors precious additional time to intervene before patients crashed. Layla's team was expanding to pediatric applications, helping identify children who couldn't verbalize their pain. Purpose, not performance. I'd found my park bench ritual, Central Park, every Sunday morning, phones silenced, just watching the world wake up. Joggers, dog walkers, families pushing strollers toward another ordinary day of living their actual lives instead of performing them for audiences that didn't matter. The war was over. Not because I'd destroyed my enemies, but because I'd remembered who I actually was underneath all the corporate theater. Clarraine was rebuilding her life around teaching kids to code. Victor was learning what real work felt like, and I was finally free to build things that mattered instead of funding other people's fantasies. Success, I'd realized, wasn't a room full of applause from people who'd forget your name the moment the check stopped clearing. It wasn't magazine covers or keynote speeches or diamond rings presented at other people's birthday parties. Success was code that solved real problems. Students who left class excited about algorithms. Companies that created value instead of extracting it. Sleeping well because your work mattered to people who mattered. I'd spent 20 years thinking that having everything meant owning everything. But sitting on that bench, watching Central Park fill with people living their authentic, unperformed lives, I understood the difference between winning and being free. The city stretched out in front of me, full of problems that needed solving and people smart enough to solve them. Somewhere out there, another 20-something was writing code in a coffee shop. Another startup was choosing substance over spectacle. Another entrepreneur was learning that real wealth comes from building things that last. I once thought success was a room full of applause. Now I know it's a life where no one is performing and the work still shines. That's my win.